Each year, military personnel conducting operations in the vast desert territories of the American Southwest report encounters with entities that the indigenous Navajo people have warned outsiders about for centuries, phenomena so deeply embedded in tribal culture that mention of them is considered taboo, even among the elders who keep the old stories alive. It occurs with such disturbing regularity that classified protocols exist within the Department of Defense, specifically addressing what internal documents refer to as shapeshifter encounters in restricted indigenous territories, with specialized response teams maintained at an annual cost exceeding $38 million for situations that officially have never happened and could never happen according to conventional military doctrine. During the height of Cold War tensions in 1987, over 4,000 military personnel were stationed across various installations throughout Arizona and New Mexico, conducting surveillance operations, weapons testing, and reconnaissance missions in some of the most isolated and unforgiving terrain in North America, where temperatures could swing from 115 degrees during the day to below freezing at night, and where the nearest civilian population might be over 100 miles away across endless stretches of sand, rock, and scrub brush that stretched to horizons shimmering with heat distortion. For a brief period during the scorching summer of July 1987, one six-man reconnaissance team from Fort Huachuca's Intelligence and Security Command would experience something so profoundly terrifying and so systematically methodical in its hunting behavior that it would result in the emergency evacuation of 3 separate military installations, the immediate classification of all related documentation under protocols typically reserved for nuclear weapons, incidents, and the establishment of permanent exclusion zones in certain areas of the Navajo Nation that remain off-limits to all federal personnel to this very day. But what exactly was the entity that stalked these trained soldiers through the burning desert with an intelligence that seemed to understand military tactics better than their own instructors? And why did each man who survived report that the creature wore the faces of their fellow soldiers who had already been taken, calling out for help in voices that were perfect in every detail, except for something fundamentally wrong that their instincts recognized even when their conscious minds refused to accept it? The Navajo Nation encompasses over 27,000 square miles of high desert plateau, spanning portions of Arizona, New Mexico, and Utah, making it the largest Native American territory in the United States and one of the most sparsely populated regions in the country, with an average of fewer than 7 people per square mile in many areas. The landscape is characterized by endless expanses of red sand, massive rock formations that rise like ancient monuments from the desert floor, deep canyons, carved by flash floods over millennia, and vegetation limited primarily to hardy scrub, brush, mesquite, and occasional clusters of juniper trees that provide the only shade for miles in any direction. Summer temperatures regularly exceed 110 degrees Fahrenheit, creating heat mirages that make distant objects appear to float and shimmer, while the dry air sucks moisture from exposed skin in minutes, and the sun beats down with an intensity that can cause heat stroke in less than an hour without proper precautions, and at night, the temperature can drop 50 degrees, transforming the desert into a frozen wasteland under skies so clear and dark that the Milky Way casts actual shadows on the ground. The Navajo people have inhabited this harsh environment for centuries, developing an intimate understanding of the land and its dangers, both natural and supernatural. And among the many taboos and warnings passed down through generations, none is spoken of with more fear and reluctance than the Yi Naug Lushi, which translates roughly as "he who walks on all fours," or more commonly known by the word that makes even skeptical anthropologists uncomfortable to speak aloud, the Skinwalker. It is perhaps unsurprising then that this particular stretch of desert, located in a remote corner of the reservation, approximately 60 miles northwest of Chino, Arizona, has been the site of disappearances and unexplained deaths dating back to the earliest Spanish expeditions in the 1500s, with conquistador journals describing areas where the Rey Navajo guides absolutely refused to travel, speaking of brujos malignos, who could take the shape of animals and who hunted humans for sport and sustenance. According to traditional Navajo belief, carefully documented by anthropologists who were permitted to record only the most general aspects of these deeply protected stories. A skinwalker is created when a medicine person or Yi-Nal-Lushi chooses to violate the most fundamental taboos of their culture, typically by murdering a close family member, often a sibling, and performing a specific ritual that involves wearing the skin of the animal whose form they wish to assume. The accounts describe these beings as having the ability to transform into coyotes, wolves, bears, crows, or owls, though they retain a fundamentally wrong quality that animals and perceptive. Humans can detect moving with unnatural speed and agility that defies the physical limitations of the creatures they imitate, and possessing an intelligence that is distinctly horrifyingly human, even when wearing an animal's face. Perhaps most disturbing are the descriptions of their abilities, when in human form, said to be capable of mimicking the appearance and voice of specific individuals with perfect accuracy, reading thoughts and knowing private information that would be impossible for a stranger to possess, and controlling the minds of weaker-willed people through simple eye contact or through methods that traditional sources refuse to describe in any detail. The Navajo maintain that speaking about skinwalkers in detail, particularly using their true name, can attract their attention and mark the speaker as a target, and even heavily assimilated tribal members who have lived in cities for decades will still refuse to discuss them openly, while tribal police on the reservation have official policies for handling reports of skinwalker encounters that treat them as credible threats, requiring specific response protocols rather than dismissing them as superstition. Military encounters with anomalous entities in the region have been documented since the establishment of Fort Huachuca in 1877, with particularly disturbing incidents occurring during the 1950s and 1960s when nuclear weapons testing and other classified projects brought large numbers of personnel into previously restricted areas of the desert. A classified report from 1963, partially declassified through FOIA requests in 2004, though heavily redacted, describes an incident where a two-man patrol from Davis-Monthan Air Force Base reported being followed for over 18 hours by what they initially believed was a large coyote. But the animal displayed behaviors that became increasingly disturbing, including standing upright on its hind legs to look through the window of their vehicle, attempting to open the door handle with its paws, and most disturbingly appearing to speak, or at least produce sounds that resembled human speech patterns, though the words were unintelligible. When the airmen finally reached their base and reported the incident, their commanding officer immediately ordered a security team to investigate, but when they returned to the location with tracking dogs, the animals refused to leave the vehicles, cowering and whimpering, despite being trained military working dogs with extensive experience in hostile environments. And the tracking team discovered prints in the sand that started as canine, but gradually shifted over the course of several hundred yards into something that resembled human footprints, though with clawed toes and a stride length that suggested either impossibly long legs or something that was moving in leaps that covered over 12 feet per bound. The report concludes with a recommendation that personnel avoid solo or two-man patrols in certain designated areas, and that any encounters with wildlife displaying unusual behavior should be reported immediately and result in automatic weapon authorization regardless of normal rules of engagement. Suggestions that were quietly implemented across multiple installations in the Southwest without any official explanation provided to the personnel who would be expected to follow them. July 14, 1987, 0530 hours. The sun was already transforming the Arizona desert into a furnace that would reach 112 degrees by noon, when Staff Sergeant Raymond Chun Calsoin, Tracker, led his 6-man reconnaissance team into the restricted zone with orders to conduct surveillance on suspected Soviet satellite monitoring stations that intelligence suggested might be operating illegally within the Navajo Nation's boundaries. Chung was a 15-year intelligence veteran who had served 2 tours in West Germany, running counter-surveillance operations against KGB operatives, the kind of soldier who could disappear into any environment and observe targets for days without being detected. Exactly the type of professional the Army trusted to operate in politically sensitive areas where a single mistake could create an international incident or destroy decades of carefully maintained relationships with tribal governments. His team consisted of Sergeant First Class William "Billy" So, a full-blooded Navajo from Shiprock, who served as their cultural liaison and translator, despite his visible discomfort with the mission's location. Specialist Marcus Webb, their communications specialist, and a former college athlete who treated every operation like it was a competition he intended to win. Corporal Jennifer Hastings, one of the first women to serve in Army intelligence field operations, and determined to prove she belonged there through sheer competence and refusal to acknowledge physical limitations. Private First Class Robert "Bobby" Klein, their junior medic who had joined the Army to pay for medical school and constantly second-guessed whether he made the right choice. Sergeant Paul Donnelly, their second-in-command and heavy weapons specialist, who had served in Vietnam and approached every mission with the weary professionalism of someone who had seen enough combat to know that luck runs out eventually. And Private Nathan Garrett, barely 21 years old and so eager to prove himself that he'd volunteered for every dangerous assignment since completing training. They had been inserted by helicopter at 0200 hours under cover of darkness, dropped 15 miles from their primary objective, with orders to move on foot to avoid detection, establish an observation post, and maintain radio silence except for scheduled check-ins every 12 hours. A routine intelligence gathering mission that had been conducted dozens of times in various forms across the Southwest without incident. The first indication that something was fundamentally wrong came at 0547 hours when So, who was walking point approximately 40 meters ahead of the main group, suddenly stopped and raised his fist in the signal for immediate halt, then dropped to one knee and began what looked like a prayer or chant in Navajo, words spoken so quietly that even Chun couldn't hear them clearly when he moved forward to investigate. When Chun reached So's position, he found the sergeant staring at a rock formation about 30 meters to their left, a cluster of red sandstone boulders that didn't look particularly remarkable in the dawn light. But So was visibly shaking and refused to move forward, instead turning to Chun and saying in a voice that barely qualified as a whisper that they needed to abort the mission immediately, that this area was what his grandmother had called a place where the skin changers walk, and that the elders had specific warnings about these formations that every Navajo child learned before they could even speak. Chun, operating under strict orders and facing potential career consequences if he aborted a classified mission based on what his superiors would dismiss as superstition, made the decision that he would regret for the rest of his life and ordered the team to continue, assigning Donnelly to move up and take point while So fell back to the middle of the formation. And as they moved past the rock formation, Chun noticed something that made his combat instincts start screaming warnings, even though he couldn't articulate exactly what was wrong. There were tracks in the sand near the rocks, canine prints that looked like they belonged to a large coyote or possibly a wolf, but the prints were strange in ways that bothered him. Too perfectly formed, too regularly spaced, and most disturbing, they seemed to start and end at the rocks with no indication of where the animal had come from or where it had gone, as if something had simply materialized, walked in a perfect circle around the formation, and then vanished back into whatever reality it had emerged from. They continued their approach toward the objective for another 2 hours, the heat building with every minute as the sun climbed higher and transformed their surroundings into a landscape of shimmering distortion where distances became impossible to judge accurately, and the horizon seemed to retreat as they advanced toward it. At 0753 hours, Hastings reported movement on the right flank, something keeping pace with them, approximately 200 meters out, moving between the scattered vegetation and rock formations in a way that suggested it was deliberately using cover and concealment, behavior that indicated either another military unit or something with enough intelligence to understand tactical movement. Chun brought the team to a defensive halt and used his binoculars to scan the area where Hastings had indicated. And after nearly 3 minutes of careful observation, he caught a glimpse of what looked like a large coyote moving between two clusters of mesquite. But even from this distance, there was something wrong about the way it moved. Too fluid, too purposeful. And when it stopped and turned to look directly at their position, Chun felt his stomach clench with primal fear, because even at 200 meters, he could swear the animal was smiling, its mouth open in what should have been a normal canine expression, but instead looked disturbingly like human amusement. Webb tried to get better imagery with the team's camera equipment, but every photograph he took came out wrong, either completely overexposed despite proper settings or showing strange distortions. Around the area where the animal should have been, dark shadows that seemed to move independently of any light source, and what looked like multiple exposures overlapping, even though he was using single-shot mode, and his radio equipment began picking up interference that sounded almost like human speech played backward and slowed down, until the words were incomprehensible, but the emotional tone of mockery came through clearly. So had gone completely pale, telling Chun, in a voice tight with barely controlled panic, that they needed to leave immediately, that what they were seeing wasn't an animal, but was something pretending to be an animal, and that the fact it was showing itself meant it had already decided they were prey and was simply toying with them before it attacked. But Chun still had his orders, still had a mission to complete, and made the second catastrophic decision of the day by ordering them to continue toward their objective while maintaining heightened alertness for the wildlife they had observed. By 11:34 hours, they had reached a position overlooking their target area, a small collection of buildings and antenna arrays that looked exactly like the intelligence photographs they had been briefed on. And Chun was establishing their observation post when Klein, who had moved slightly away from the main group to relieve himself behind a rock formation, started screaming in a way that didn't sound anything like a trained soldier, but instead like a child who had just witnessed something that shattered his understanding of how reality worked. The team rushed to his position, with weapons raised, to find Klein standing frozen with his pants still around his ankles, pointing at something in the sand, approximately 10 feet from where he stood. And when Chun looked down, he saw prints that made his mouth go dry with fear, even though his rational mind was desperately trying to find a normal explanation for what he was seeing. The tracks started as normal coyote prints, clear and detailed in the fine sand. But after about 6 feet, they began to change, the paw prints gradually morphing into something that looked more like a human handprint, though the fingers were too long, and ended in what appeared to be claws. And after another few feet, the prints had fully transformed into human footprints, bare feet with distinct toe impressions, except the proportions were wrong, too narrow, too long, and the stride had shifted from four-legged movement to bipedal walking, and the tracks led directly from where they had first spotted the coyote hours earlier to this exact position, as if something had been following them the entire time, watching them, and had only recently decided to reveal its true nature by leaving evidence that defied every natural law they understood. But what made Klein continue screaming until Donnelly physically grabbed him and clamped a hand over his mouth was the realization that became clear when they followed the tracks backward. They had been made within the last 10 minutes based on how crisp the edges were in the dry sand, meaning whatever made them had been standing exactly where Klein was now standing, watching the team establish their observation post, standing close enough that Klein should have seen it, should have heard it, should have sensed its presence in some way, but instead, he had walked right past it without knowing he was within touching distance of something that had transformed from animal to humanoid and was now watching them from somewhere nearby, invisible yet close, patient yet hungry, and absolutely certain that these 7 soldiers were isolated, vulnerable, and completely unprepared for what was about to happen when the sun finally set and the desert darkness gave it every advantage. Chun immediately ordered the team into a tight defensive perimeter in the rocks, abandoning their observation mission in favor of survival, as every instinct he had developed over 15 years of military service screamed at him that they were being hunted by something that understood tactics and terrain better than most human adversaries he had faced. Webb worked frantically to establish communication with their command post, cycling through every frequency and using emergency protocols that should have triggered an immediate response regardless of their radio silence orders. But instead of the reassuring voice of their operations officer, all he received was that same disturbing interference patterns of static that almost formed words, sounds that might have been laughter or might have been the desert wind distorted through electronic equipment in ways that shouldn't be possible according to any understanding of how radio waves functioned. At one point, they all clearly heard what sounded like Chung's own voice coming through the radio, requesting immediate extraction due to equipment failure and giving coordinates that were approximately 5 miles south of their actual position. And when Webb tried to transmit that this was not their message and that someone or something was using their authentication codes, the radio simply went dead, completely non-functional, despite showing full battery power and no physical damage. So finally broke his terrified silence and began explaining in a rush of words that came out so fast they almost ran together, telling them everything his grandmother had made him promise never to speak about to outsiders, how the Yi Naldlushi were not animals, but were Navajo who had chosen the darkest path of their medicine traditions, killing their own family members, to gain the power to transform how they could read thoughts and see the future and move faster than the eye could follow. How they specifically targeted groups rather than individuals, because they fed on fear and confusion and the breakdown of trust that happened when people couldn't tell who was real and who was wearing stolen skin. Donnelly suggested they needed to move from their current position immediately. That military doctrine for ambush situations required breaking contact and relocating to new ground. But when they began to gather their equipment, Hastings noticed something that made everyone freeze in place. There were now tracks surrounding their position, dozens of them circling the rocks they had taken shelter in, and the prints showed the same disturbing transformation pattern they had seen earlier, starting as coyote prints in multiple points around the perimeter, but gradually shifting into those impossible humanoid tracks, as if multiple entities had been circling them while they were focused on the radio, or more disturbingly, as if a single entity had moved around their position multiple times at impossible speed, changing forms with each pass. Klein pulled out their issued topographical maps and tried to plot an escape route back toward their extraction point. But as he spread the maps across a flat rock, he noticed with growing horror that someone had marked them, red ink that none of them recognized, showing their planned route with perfect accuracy, including waypoints they had only decided on during the helicopter insertion. And at each marked position was a symbol that so identified as a traditional Navajo pictograph representing death or transformation. And at the very end of their route, circled multiple times, was a drawing that looked disturbingly like a human figure with a coyote's head, and written in English beneath it in handwriting that matched Chun's exactly was a single sentence that none of them remembered writing. "It knows where we're going, because it's already been there." The temperature was approaching its daily peak of 114 degrees, and the heat was doing strange things to their perception, making the air shimmer and warp in ways that seemed more pronounced than normal desert heat distortion. And several team members reported seeing movement in their peripheral vision that disappeared when they turned to look directly at it. At 13:47 hours, Garrett, who had been maintaining watch on their eastern approach, suddenly stood up and announced in a completely calm voice that he needed to go check something, that he had seen his brother standing about 50 yards out waving to him, and it took Donnelly and Hastings physically restraining him to prevent him from walking away from the defensive position And even as they held him down, Garrett kept insisting that they didn't understand, that his brother needed help, that he could see him clearly out there in the heat shimmer. But his brother had died in a car accident in 1983, and there was no possible way he could be standing in the Arizona desert 4 years later. When Garrett finally stopped struggling and seemed to return to his senses, he had no memory of what he had just said or done, and he looked at the team with genuine confusion about why they were restraining him and why everyone was looking at him with expressions that mixed fear and suspicion. So whispered to Chun that this was how it started, that the Yi Nald Lushi could project thoughts and visions directly into people's minds, making them see things that weren't there, or more dangerously, making them trust things that appeared friendly and familiar, until it was too late to escape, and that once someone had been touched mentally by the entity, they became a beacon that would lead it directly to the group, no matter where they tried to hide. They heard the first scream at 15:23 hours, a human voice somewhere to their north, maybe quarter-mile away, based on how sound carried in the desert, shouting for help in English, with an accent that was distinctly Midwestern, yelling that he was a lost hiker and his girlfriend was injured, and they desperately needed medical assistance and could see the soldiers' position from where they were. Chun knew with absolute certainty that there were no civilian hikers in this area, that they were operating in restricted military training space that was explicitly closed to the public, and that this was another lure, another trick. But the voice was so desperate, so convincingly human in its panic and fear, that he felt his training trying to override his instincts, felt his body preparing to respond to someone in distress, even though his mind was screaming that this was exactly what the entity wanted. Klein actually started moving toward his medical kit, his training as a medic, creating an automatic response to reports of injured people. But Hastings grabbed his arm hard enough to leave bruises and hissed at him to remember the tracks. Remember, Garrett, remember that nothing out here was what it seemed. The screaming continued for 8 minutes, getting progressively more agonized and desperate, describing injuries in graphic medical detail that suggested someone with actual medical training, mentioning specific terms like compound fracture and arterial bleeding, and going into shock. And then the voice changed mid-sentence, shifting from the Midwestern accent to something that sounded exactly like Klein's mother calling his name, saying, "Bobby, honey, I know you can hear me. Please help these people. You took an oath to help people. Don't let them die, because these soldiers are too scared to do the right thing." And Klein started crying, covering his ears, and repeating, "That's not my mother. That's not my mother," over and over, like a mantra that might protect him from what was clearly speaking with perfect knowledge of his life, his family, his deepest motivations for becoming a medic. At 18:47 hours, as the sun finally began its descent toward the horizon and the brutal heat started to ease, they discovered that Garrett was gone, and nobody could remember exactly when they had last seen him, couldn't pinpoint the moment when he had moved from his position, couldn't explain how a trained soldier had simply vanished from a tight defensive perimeter where everyone should have been watching everyone else. Webb found Garrett's rifle leaning against a rock, exactly where he should have been sitting, but his web gear and canteens were gone, and in the sand beside his weapon was a note written in Garrett's handwriting that said, "I saw my brother again, and this time I know he's real. I'm going to go with him. Don't try to follow me. I finally understand what's happening, and it's beautiful. I'll see you all soon." They heard Garrett's voice approximately 30 minutes later, calling from somewhere in the darkening desert, telling them he was fine, that he had found something amazing, that they needed to come see what he had discovered. But the voice was wrong in ways that were impossible to articulate. The words were right, and the tone was enthusiastic, like Garrett always was. But there was something underneath it, something that sounded like multiple voices speaking in perfect unison. And when Chun shouted back, asking for authentication codes that only Garrett would know, the voice stopped mid-sentence and was replaced by the sound of something moving through the brush, multiple footsteps coming from different directions, circling their position in the growing darkness. and so began praying in Navajo traditional protection chants that his grandmother had taught him, while the rest of the team checked their weapons and prepared for whatever was coming when the sun finally set and the desert belonged to something that had been hunting. Humans in this land for centuries, patient and intelligent, and absolutely certain that these 6 remaining soldiers had nowhere to run and no way to call for help, and no defenses that would matter against something that could look like anyone, sound like anyone, and knew their thoughts before they even formed them into conscious awareness. The sun dropped below the horizon at 1934 hours, and the desert transformed from a furnace into something far more sinister as shadows stretched and merged, and the temperature began its rapid plunge toward what would be a freezing night, and in that liminal space between day and night, between the world they understood and something fundamentally other, the team heard Garrett screaming, real screaming this time, not the calm conversational voice from earlier, but sounds of pure agony and terror that came from approximately 400 meters to their northwest. Screams that started human, but degraded into something that shouldn't be able to come from a human throat. Wet gurgling sounds mixed with what might have been words, or might have been something trying to form words using vocal cords that were being torn apart. Chun made the decision to move toward the screams, despite every tactical instinct screaming at him to stay in their defensive position. Because Garrett was his soldier, his responsibility, and because the alternative was listening to those sounds and doing nothing, and the 5 remaining team members moved out in a tactical formation, with night vision equipment activated, weapons at the ready, each of them knowing with absolute certainty that they were walking into a trap but unable to stop themselves, because that's what soldiers do. They move toward the sound of their brothers in distress, even when it means walking into hell. They found Garrett 18 minutes later, or what was left of him, and the scene was so impossibly wrong that Hastings actually vomited into her bandana, while Klein stood frozen, unable to process what his medical training was telling him about the body in front of them. Garrett's corpse was arranged in a sitting position against a large boulder, and at first glance, in the green glow of night vision, he almost looked peaceful, like he had just sat down to rest. But as they got closer, the details resolved into nightmare fuel that would haunt them for whatever remained of their lives. His face had been removed with surgical precision, the skin peeled back in one complete piece like a mask, and it was hanging from a nearby mesquite branch, swaying gently in the desert breeze. And where his face should have been was exposed muscle and bone, but his eyes were still intact in their sockets, and they were open, staring directly at the approaching team with an expression of such profound terror that it was visible even without the context of facial features. His chest had been opened, ribs spread apart in a way that required either incredible strength or knowledge of exactly where to apply pressure to break bones without splintering them. And his heart was missing, the cavity where it should have been completely empty and surprisingly bloodless, given the violence of the wounds. And carved into the exposed flesh of his chest, in symbols that so immediately recognized as corrupted versions of traditional Navajo healing symbols, was a message, but the symbols had been inverted, twisted into their opposite meanings. Transformations of protection into invitation, healing into harm, life into death. But what made the scene transcend from merely horrific into something that violated every law of how human bodies should work was that Garrett's mouth was moving, his jaw working up and down, and sounds were coming from his throat, despite the fact that his lungs had been removed along with his heart. Sounds that formed words in a voice that was no longer Garrett's, but was instead a perfect imitation of Chun's voice, saying, "You're next, Raymond. I can taste your fear from here. It tastes like your mother's tears when they told her you were dead. Want to know how I know what that tastes like?" They ran, all tactical training and discipline evaporating in the face of something so fundamentally wrong that their primal survival instincts took over completely, and they ran without coordination or formation back toward their original defensive position. And behind them they could hear footsteps following, multiple sets of footsteps that shouldn't be possible, because there was only one entity, only one Skinwalker, except So was screaming as they ran that they were all wrong, that his grandmother had tried to tell him, but he hadn't understood, that there was never just one, that they hunted in packs like the animals whose skins they wore, and that finding tracks from multiple animals meant there were multiple Yi Nalblushi, and they had walked directly into a hunting ground that this pack had been using for decades, maybe centuries, and that every single missing person reported in this area, going back to the Spanish conquistadors, had probably ended up exactly like Garrett, their bodies arranged as warnings and invitations for the next group of outsiders stupid enough to ignore the boundaries that the Navajo had been trying to maintain for generations. Webb's night vision equipment began malfunctioning, showing heat signatures that appeared and disappeared in impossible patterns, multiple humanoid shapes that would be standing directly in their path 1 second, and then completely absent the next. And his radio suddenly crackled to life with a transmission in Klein's voice saying, "Command, this is Charlie 27. Mission successful, returning to extraction point. Request immediate pickup, all personnel accounted for." And Shun realized with dawning horror that something was calling in false reports using their voices and authentication codes, and that, when they reached the extraction point, if they reached it, there might be nothing waiting for them, except whatever had made that call. The stars overhead were wrong again, constellations that Shun had used for navigation throughout his entire military career, now arranged in patterns he didn't recognize, and the moon, which should have been 3/4 full, according to his mission planning, was instead a thin crescent that provided almost no light, and the darkness between the stars seemed to be moving, swirling in slow spirals, like liquid rather than the fixed points of light that stars should be. And he realized with a detachment that suggested his mind was starting to break under the strain that they weren't just being hunted by entities that could change their physical forms. They were in a space where reality itself was negotiable, where the rules of physics and biology and time were suggestions rather than laws, and that the Skinwalkers weren't just predators, but were somehow wardens or guardians of thresholds between what was real and what was other, and by crossing into their territory with weapons and technology and the arrogance of modern military might, his team had violated boundaries that existed for very good reasons that had nothing to do with cultural sensitivity and everything to do with keeping things separate that should never be allowed to touch. Donnelly, who had been bringing up the rear of their panicked retreat, suddenly wasn't there anymore, and when they stopped to look back, they could see his silhouette approximately 50 meters behind them, standing perfectly still. And when Chun called his name, Donnelly turned and walked toward them with movements that were just slightly off, joints bending at angles that were wrong by maybe 5 degrees, but enough to trigger every unconscious alarm that human brains have developed to recognize when something wearing a human shape isn't actually human. And as he got closer, they could see that his smile was too wide, stretching past where the corners of his mouth should stop, and his eyes reflected the starlight wrong, showing not the normal red eye shine of a human in night vision, but instead that same sickly yellow glow they had seen in the coyote's eyes that morning. And Donnelly's voice said, "Going somewhere, boys? The party's just getting started, and we have so much to show you. So many beautiful things waiting in the spaces between seconds. Don't you want to see what happens when skin becomes optional?" Klein drew his sidearm and fired 6 rounds center mass into what looked like Donnelly, the muzzle flashes strobing the darkness and revealing for split seconds what was really standing there. And in those brief illuminated moments, they saw something that made the mind rebel against the input from the eyes, because what they were seeing couldn't exist, shouldn't exist, but was undeniably real in all its horrible impossibility. The thing wearing Donnelly's face had too many joints in its limbs, bones that bent in multiple places where human bones should be rigid, and its torso was elongated, stretched like taffy, and through the holes created by Klein's as bullets, they could see not organs or blood, but instead darkness that sparkled with points of awe. Light like looking into deep space, and the wounds weren't bleeding, but were instead leaking something that looked like liquid shadow that ran upward against gravity and dispersed into the air like smoke, and the entity's smile just got wider with each impact. Its jaw unhinging like a snake's to reveal rows of teeth. They were definitely not human. Some of them sharp and pointed like a predator's, others flat and grinding like an herbivore's, a biological impossibility that suggested this thing had consumed so many different creatures, that its body had incorporated aspects of all of them into whatever nightmarish anatomy it currently possessed. Hastings grabbed Klein and physically dragged him away from the entity as it began to laugh, a sound that started as Donnelly's familiar chuckle, but transformed into something that incorporated at least 5 different voices simultaneously, including Garrett's voice, and So's grandmother's voice somehow, and voices in Navajo that seemed to come from centuries past, and beneath all of it was a sound like wind through a canyon, or maybe like breathing through passages that were too large to belong to anything that should exist on Earth. They stumbled into a narrow canyon that cut between 2 massive rock formations, seeking cover and concealment, and behind them they could hear multiple entities following, no longer bothering to hide their presence, but instead announcing themselves with calls and howls that mixed coyote vocalizations with human screams, with sounds that belonged to no species that currently existed on the planet. And the sounds were coming from ahead of them and behind them and above them on the canyon walls, and they realized they had been herded exactly where the Skinwalkers wanted them, driven into a kill box with no exits. And as the moon set completely and plunged them into absolute darkness, even their night vision equipment failed, every electronic system simultaneously dying, as if something had simply reached out and turned off the laws of physics that made batteries and circuits and electromagnetic radiation function the way they were supposed to. In that total darkness, they heard So's voice saying traditional Navajo prayers, protective chants that his grandmother had taught him, and for a moment, just a brief moment, they felt something shift, felt the oppressive presence around them hesitate, as if the old words still carried some power, as if there were rules even for monsters, and certain sounds, when spoken with the right intent and the right belief, could still make things that shouldn't exist reconsider their actions. But then they heard So scream, heard him say, "No, no, grandmother, please, it's me. It's William, don't you recognize me?" And they realized that the entities had found the one thing that could break even the protection of the old ceremonies. They were showing So visions of his beloved grandmother, the woman who had raised him, who had taught him everything he knew about his culture, and they were making him see her as one of them, making him believe that she had been Yi Naldlushi all along, that everything she had taught him was a lie designed to prepare him for this moment. And So's screaming turned into laughter, hysterical broken laughter that suggested his mind had finally shattered under the psychological assault. And when Webb tried to reach out to grab him in the darkness, his hand closed on something that felt like skin, but was cold, far too cold, and whatever he was touching began to move under his palm, shifting and flowing like liquid. And Webb pulled his hand back with burned fingers, as if he had touched something that existed at temperatures far below what the desert night should be capable of producing. Chun made the final command decision of his military career and ordered everyone to fire, not at specific targets because they couldn't see specific targets in the total darkness, but simply to fire everything they had in every direction, to fill the canyon with lead and hope and desperation. And the muzzle flashes created a strobe-like nightmare of brief images that revealed things moving all around them, things that were tall and skeletal and wearing familiar faces, multiple versions of Garrett and Donnelly moving in unison, and things that looked like animals but with human hands, and things that seemed to be made of shadow itself with only eyes visible, dozens of yellow eyes watching them from every direction, and the sound of their weapons firing echoed and re-echoed off the canyon walls until it sounded like an army shooting. Hundreds of soldiers engaged in combat, and through it all they could hear laughter, that terrible multi-voiced laughter that seemed to find their resistance amusing rather than threatening. And Chun felt something touch the back of his neck, felt fingers that were far too long and had far too many joints stroke his skin, almost gently, almost lovingly, and a voice that was his own voice but wrong. fundamentally wrong in ways he couldn't articulate, whispered directly into his ear. "We're going to keep you, Raymond. You're going to help us learn new faces, new voices, and your team's going to help us practice. Don't worry, it won't hurt." Well, not much. Well, actually, it's going to hurt a great deal, but you'll get used to it eventually. Everyone does. Just ask the others we've kept. They're still here, still conscious, still aware, wearing our skin and walking our walk, unable to die, unable to escape, unable to do anything except watch through eyes that aren't theirs anymore, as we use their forms to hunt new prey. The sound of multiple Black Hawk helicopters approaching at high speed cut through the nightmare at 2,147 hours, their rotors and engines creating a cacophony that seemed to physically push back the darkness. And searchlights mounted on the aircraft swept across the canyon in brilliant white beams that made the Skinwalkers recoil for the first time since the hunt had begun. Chun felt the fingers release from his neck as something resembling military discipline took over. Soldiers in hazmat suits fast roping down into the canyon with flamethrowers and weapons that looked experimental, flooding the area with fire that clung to the rocks and sent the entities retreating into shadows that suddenly had nowhere to hide. A colonel without name tags grabbed Chun and the three remaining survivors, Hastings, Klein, and Webb, physically throwing them into the nearest helicopter while teams below systematically incinerated everything within a quarter-mile radius. And as they lifted off, Chun looked down to see So standing in the flames, watching them leave with yellow eyes and that too wide smile, waving goodbye with Donnelly's hand grafted onto his wrist. And the colonel leaned close and said, "You were never here. This mission never happened. Those men are already listed as training accident casualties. And if you value your sanity, you will accept the story we give you and never speak the truth to anyone understood." Chun woke 3 days later in a military psychiatric facility with no windows and no identifying markers, his memories fragmentary and corrupted. Doctors telling him he'd experienced severe heat stroke and dehydration that caused shared hallucinations, showing him fabricated evidence of normal search and rescue operations. So Garrett and Donnelly were officially killed in a vehicle rollover during routine training at Fort Huachuca, their families given flag-draped coffins that felt too light when the honor guards carried them. And when Chun tried to attend Garrett's funeral 6 months later after his medical discharge, Garrett's mother pulled him aside and whispered that Nathan had called her last week, that his voice sounded wrong, but he said he was fine, just working on a classified project and couldn't come home yet. And would Chun please tell her son to stop calling, because hearing his voice after burying him was breaking her heart in ways that would never heal. The canyon where the incident occurred was permanently designated as a contaminated site due to unexploded ordnance from Cold War weapons testing, with automated systems monitoring for unauthorized entry. Though satellite imagery shows regular thermal signatures moving through the area in patterns that suggest coordinated movement, and local Navajo continue to report that certain voices call to them from that direction on quiet nights, voices of ancestors and loved ones and friends, all asking them to come home, come visit, come see what beautiful things are waiting just beyond the boundary markers that everyone knows should never, ever be crossed. The official after-action report for the July 1987 reconnaissance mission, buried under classification levels typically reserved for nuclear weapons protocols, lists the operation as a complete failure due to equipment malfunction and environmental factors, with 3 personnel killed in a vehicle accident during return to base and the remaining team members suffering severe psychological trauma requiring extended psychiatric care and medical retirement. Staff Sergeant Raymond Chun was honorably discharged in November 1987 with full disability benefits for post-traumatic stress disorder and heat-induced psychosis. His service records sanitized to remove any mention of operations in Arizona, and he was last known to be living in a secured psychiatric facility in New Mexico, where he spends his days drawing maps of the canyon over and over, marking locations with Navajo symbols he shouldn't know, and writing warnings in languages he never studied. And the facility staff report that he refuses to look at photographs of people, claiming that he can see something wrong in their eyes, something that's wearing their faces but isn't them. And twice he's attacked orderlies who came to check on him at night, screaming that he can smell the desert on them and that they're not fooling him with their stolen skin. Corporal Jennifer Hastings attempted to return to normal military service, but was discharged after she requested transfer away from any assignment that involved desert environments, and she was found dead in her Seattle apartment in 1993, officially ruled a suicide by carbon monoxide poisoning, though the responding officers noted in their reports that every window and door had been sealed from the outside, and neighbors reported hearing multiple voices arguing in her apartment for hours before her death, despite the fact that she lived alone and her phone records showed no calls made or received that day. Private First Class Robert Klein completed medical school using his VA benefits and established a practice in rural Montana. But his medical license was revoked in 1998 after he began refusing to treat any patient who claimed to have Navajo ancestry, telling colleagues that he could see something moving under their skin, something that wasn't human tissue, but was instead writhing darkness held in place by stolen flesh. And he disappeared into the Canadian wilderness in 2001, leaving behind a journal filled with anatomical drawings that showed human bodies opened up to reveal internal structures that didn't match any known biology creatures living inside people like parasites. And his final entry read, "I finally understand what they were trying to teach us. The human body is just a vehicle, just transportation. And once you know how to drive it properly, you can go anywhere, be anyone. I'm going to find them and ask them to teach me. I'm going to learn how to slip between skins like changing clothes. I'm going to become something that doesn't have to be afraid anymore." Specialist Marcus Webb worked as a communications contractor for various defense companies, but he was found dead in 2004 in the Arizona desert, approximately 15 miles from where the original incident occurred. His body discovered by hikers who reported that he appeared to have walked into the restricted area deliberately, despite all the warning signs. And the medical examiner noted that Webb's face was missing, removed with surgical precision, and his body was arranged in a sitting position against a boulder in a way that seemed deliberately staged and carved into the rock behind him, in symbols that the investigation team refused to photograph were words in English that said, "He came home, he remembered where he belonged, the rest will follow when they're ready." The section of Navajo Nation where the incident occurred remains under joint federal tribal jurisdiction, with access restrictions that are enforced by both military police and traditional Navajo Rangers. Officially designated as culturally sensitive heritage land with unexploded ordnance contamination, though thermal satellite imagery shows regular movement in the area that suggests large animals or possibly human-sized entities moving in coordinated patterns, and multiple hikers and hunters who have ignored the boundary markers over the past 3 decades have been reported missing, with search and rescue operations recovering either no trace of them or discovering their camping equipment arranged in circles, with their personal effects laid out in patterns that Navajo consultants refuse to interpret or explain. Documents obtained through leaked internal communications suggest that similar restricted zones exist throughout the Southwest, particularly in areas where indigenous peoples maintain warnings about specific locations, and that the Department of Defense has established a classified monitoring program called Operation Threshold Guardian, with an annual black budget exceeding $400 million, dedicated to maintaining boundaries between what the documents describe as consensus reality zones and disputed territory where standard physics cannot be guaranteed to apply consistently. The Navajo Nation Tribal Council has refused all requests for interviews about the 1987 incident or about traditional beliefs regarding Yi Nald Lushi, though council members have been overheard in closed sessions discussing the need to maintain the old agreements, to keep feeding the boundaries with offerings and respect, and to ensure that younger generations understand that some warnings exist not to control them, but to protect them from things that were ancient when the first humans walked the continent. Things that are patient and hungry and perfectly willing to wait another 1,000 years if necessary. Because to something that exists partially outside of linear time, human lifespans are just heartbeats. And human civilization is just a temporary interruption in hunting grounds that have existed since before humans learned to make fire or speak language or understand that there are some territories that belong to the other and should never ever be reclaimed. Don't forget to follow our channel for more military encounters. Hit the notification bell so you never miss our investigations into phenomena that defy everything we've been taught about reality. And subscribe to join our community of truth seekers who refuse to accept official explanations that ignore overwhelming evidence.